The girl would not sit down. That was the thing nobody could explain afterward, the detail that stayed with everyone who had been in that room. She stood at the head of the long folding table in the Millbrook Grange hall with her paper crown slightly tilted and her small hands pressed flat to the tablecloth, and she looked at the door and she waited. The cake was melting on the right side from the space heater someone had dragged too close. The balloons were starting to sag. 47 people had told her to sit, had pulled the chair out, had set her juice cup right in front of it, and she had looked at each one of them the same way, politely and with complete finality, and she had not sat down. She was 8 years old. Her name was Ida Foss, and the reason she stood there, the reason she kept her eyes on that door, was the part nobody in that room was ready for. A cold morning in November in Coconino County, Arizona, and the scrub outside was the color of old straw in the flat white light coming off the overcast, the kind of light that has no shadows and no warmth, just visibility, just the hard fact of the land stretched out to the mesa line and the Joshua trees standing in it like they were waiting too. Raylan Cord pulled his truck into the gravel lot of the Millbrook Grange Hall at 9:47 in the morning and sat there for a moment with both hands still on the wheel. He was 53 years old, 6'1", 230 pounds, none of it arranged for anyone's comfort. His hair had been dark once and was now the iron gray of a road in rain, worn to his collar, and his beard came to the second button of his flannel shirt, which was the same beard it had been for 20 years, the same beard every member of the Ash Creek Riders had watched go from pepper to frost, without anybody saying a word about it because some things are not commented upon. His knuckles on the steering wheel were the knuckles of a man who had spent 30 years doing things with his hands that left marks. The ring finger on his left hand sat slightly wrong, healed without being set correctly, a thing that had happened in 1998 and was never discussed. He wore his cut over the flannel, the Ash Creek Riders patch on the back, the Coconino County rocker underneath it, and the president's patch on the front left where it had lived for 19 years. He was the last of the 4 men who had founded the club in a rented garage outside Ash Creek in 2005, which meant that certain things stopped with him and certain things would not end until he did, and he had made his peace with both of those facts a long time ago. He had driven 40 minutes from the clubhouse on CR 6144 because a woman named Sandra Foss had called the number that was not listed anywhere except by word of mouth in a 20-mile radius, the number people called when they needed something that the county couldn't provide, and the church couldn't provide, and their own people had run out of the capacity to provide. Sandra had said her daughter was turning 8, and she had asked for one thing, and the one thing was not a thing any reasonable person would have thought to ask for. Raylan got out of the truck. The Grange Hall sat at the end of a gravel road with scrub oak on 3 sides and the old water tower at the back, and the parking lot had 6 cars in it, which was not enough cars for a child's birthday party, and he noticed that the way a man notices the thing that is already wrong before he can name it. He had brought a card with a 20 inside. He did not know what else to bring for an 8-year-old girl he had never met. He went to the door. Ida Foss was standing at the head of the table. He saw her through the window before he opened the door, this small person with the paper crown, both hands on the tablecloth, looking at the entrance like she had been looking at it since before anyone arrived. And something moved in his chest then that he did not have language for, a thing that was not pity, because pity looks down, and this feeling was entirely level, entirely even, like recognizing a posture you yourself had held for years. He opened the door and she looked at him and she said, "Are you Mr. Cord?" "Yes," he said. "My mom said you might come." "I did come," he said. She nodded with the gravity of someone checking an item off a list that mattered. She still did not sit down. He came the rest of the way into the room, and he looked at Sandra Foss, who stood near the kitchen doorway with her arms crossed at the waist. in the way a person holds themselves when they have been trying not to fall apart for several hours and are doing a reasonable job. She was 31 years old, thin in the way that is not chosen, with dark circles that spoke of a particular kind of tired, the kind that sleep does not fix. She nodded at him. He nodded back. He looked around the room at the 47 people who had filled it, family and neighbors and 3 women from Ida's school, all of them watching him come in, several of them watching him the way people watch something they are not sure yet whether to be alarmed by, and he did not adjust himself for any of it because he had long since stopped adjusting himself for rooms. He sat in the nearest chair, uninvited, because standing at the edge of a thing when you have been asked to be part of it accomplishes nothing, and he put his forearms on the table and he looked at Ida Foss, who was still standing, and he said, "Who are you waiting for?" And she said, 350. My mom said 350. The room went quiet in the specific way rooms go quiet when a child has said something true that every adult in the room already knows and has been hoping not to address. Raylan did not look away from her. He said, "Tell me about that." The thing about Ida Foss was that she did not tell things the way adults told them, with the architecture of before and after and the reasons stacked in order. She told them the way an 8-year-old tells anything, which is to say from the middle and without apology, and with the assumption that the important parts were already known. She said that her teacher at West Rock Elementary had done a unit on communities in October and that the class had gone to the Ash Creek Library and she had found a book with photographs in it, old photographs, black and white, of people doing things together, building a barn, standing at a ribbon cutting, sitting in rows at a dinner that filled 3 rooms, and she had asked the librarian what the word was for that, for when a lot of people showed up for one person because it mattered, and the librarian had said the word was solidarity, and Ida had written it in her notebook in capital letters and underlined it twice. She said she had told her mother she wanted solidarity for her birthday, and her mother had cried, not sad crying, different crying, the kind Ida had learned to distinguish over the course of her 8 years, and her mother had called Mr. Cord's number. That was the whole story. Raylan heard it with his hands flat on the table and his face doing nothing that the room could read, but somewhere behind his sternum something had shifted with the slow, deliberate weight of a gear engaging. He said, "How long have you been standing there waiting?" Ida said, "Since we got here." She paused. That was at 8:15. He looked at the clock on the wall of the Grange Hall. It was 10:12 in the morning. He said, "That's almost 2 hours." She said, "I know, but 350 is a lot of people, and they have to drive." The room was very quiet, and Sandra Foss put one hand over her mouth and turned slightly away. Raylan looked at Ida Foss and he thought about a specific morning in 2011 that he did not allow himself to think about often, a morning in a hospital corridor in Flagstaff when he had stood outside a room with his hands hanging useless and nothing coming, and no number of people anywhere in the world who could have made the thing that was happening not happen. He thought about it for exactly 2 seconds, and then he took his phone out of his cut and he called the clubhouse. Denny Garza picked up on the second ring. Denny was the club's road captain, 39 years old, built like a man who had decided somewhere in his 20s that the world was negotiable but physics was not, and he had a voice that sounded like gravel run through a pipe. Raylan said, "You at the house?" Denny said he was. Raylan said, "How many we got in range?" Denny said he could have 40 on bikes inside an hour, maybe 60 if he called Prescott. Raylan said, "Call Prescott, then call Flagstaff." There was a pause on the line, the kind that means a man is doing math he hasn't been asked to explain. Then Denny said, "What are we at total, you thinking?" Raylan said, 350. Another pause. Then Denny said, "Birthday party?" Raylan said, "Little girl. 8 years old. She's been standing up since 8:15 waiting for the number to come right." Denny did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "Give me 40 minutes for the first wave. I'll work the phones while I ride." Raylan said, "Tell them to come clean and come quiet. No pipes on the way in. Park in the field past the water tower. Walk in 2 at a time. Don't flood the room." Denny said, "Done." Raylan put the phone in his pocket and looked back at Ida Foss, who had been watching him the entire time with her hands still flat on the tablecloth. He said, "Some people are coming." She said, "How many?" He said, "Working on it." She considered this, and then she nodded with the solemnity of someone who understood that logistics take time, and that patience was simply part of the work. She still did not sit down. The 47 people in the room were very quiet. A woman near the window, Sandra Foss's older sister by the look of her, was crying silently and appeared to be embarrassed by it, which was the wrong response to the right feeling. Raylan noticed the cake and the way it was leaning from the heat of the space heater, and he got up and moved the space heater 3 feet to the left, without asking anyone if that was acceptable, because it needed to be done, and because the cake had a name on it written in green icing, and the name was Ida, and it deserved to last the morning intact. Outside the Grange Hall, in the white November light, the mesa sat on the horizon the way it always sat, patient and enormous, and entirely indifferent to the specific sorrows of specific people in specific rooms. And Raylan stood in the doorway for a moment and listened to the silence of CR 6144 and the distant sound of nothing yet. Just wind and the dry rattle of brush, and he thought about what Denny had said about the first wave, 40 minutes, and he thought about the field past the water tower and whether it would hold the weight of 350 motorcycles on frozen ground, and he decided it would hold because it needed to hold, because the alternative was not acceptable. And then he went back inside and he sat down again across from Ida Foss, who was still standing, paper crown slightly tilted, both hands on the tablecloth, looking at the door. At 11:03 in the morning, the first sound came through the walls of the Grange Hall. It was not a roar. Raylan had told Denny to come quiet, and Denny had passed that instruction down the line, and the Ash Creek riders understood what it meant when the president gave an instruction with no room for interpretation. So what came through the walls was not the sound of arrival that the people in that room had heard when big groups of motorcycles appeared in movies or on the news. It was more like a low vibration, a pressure change, the kind of thing you feel in the floor before you understand you are feeling it. Ida Foss turned her head toward the east wall. She did not move otherwise. Her hands stayed on the table. She was listening with her whole body, the way children listen when they believe. The vibration became a sound, and the sound became distinguishable. 40 or so engines idling down to nothing in the field past the water tower, and then silence, and then the crunch of boots on frozen gravel, and then the door of the Grange Hall opened and Denny Garza came through it. He was wearing his cut over a gray thermal, and his beard was shorter than Raylan's, reddish-brown gone gray at the chin, and he had a smear of engine grease on his left forearm that was simply always there, and no one had ever asked about it. He looked at the room. He looked at Raylan. He looked at Ida Foss standing at the head of the table with her paper crown and her hands on the tablecloth. He took off his sunglasses and put them in his breast pocket. He said, "First 40 are in the field. Flagstaff crew's 45 minutes out. Prescott is about an hour." He said it to Raylan, but he was looking at Ida. Ida said, "How many is 40? Denny said, 40 is 40. She thought about this. She said, "That's not 350. Denny said, "Not yet." He pulled out the nearest chair and sat down. He said, "You mind if we wait with you?" Ida looked at him for a moment with the frank appraisal of a child who has learned to take the measure of adults at speed. Then she said, "No, you can wait." One by one, the first 40 men came through the door in pairs, the way Raylan had said, and they filled the chairs that were there and stood against the walls when the chairs ran out. And they were not loud and they were not theatrical about it. They were just present. Big men in leather cuts, filling the Grange hall the way water fills a space. Finding the level without discussion, and the 47 people who had been there since before all sat a little straighter without knowing they were doing it, because there is something that happens to a room when it fills with people who have decided something, and that thing is not fear, exactly, though it can be mistaken for fear by people who have not felt it from inside. Raylan watched Ida Foss watching the room fill. Her eyes moved from face to face, and her hands stayed on the table, and she did not sit down. Sandra Foss had stopped trying to hold herself together around the middle. She stood near the kitchen doorway with tears running freely, and a look on her face that was not grief, and not gratitude exactly, but something that lived between them, something that does not have a common word, but that every person who has ever been more alone than they could bear, and then suddenly less alone, has felt land in them like a stone dropped into still water. A woman named Carla Rios, who ran the diner on Route 89 out of Ash Creek and who had driven 40 minutes because Denny had called her and she had said yes before he finished asking, came through the door with 2 cardboard boxes and set them on the counter and opened them without ceremony. They were full of paper plates and napkins and small bags of chips that she had grabbed on the way out, because she had been doing this kind of thing long enough to know that when a room fills, it needs to be fed. Raylan looked at her and she looked at him and she said, "Don't thank me. Tell me where the kitchen is," he told her. The Flagstaff crew arrived at 11:48. 45 men, some of them faces Raylan had known for a decade and some of them faces he knew by patch and by reputation, came through the door in the same quiet pairs, and the count in the room was now past 90, and the overflow was standing in the entry hall, and the men outside in the cold had started a loose line that wrapped around the side of the building. The Prescott group came in 2 waves, the first wave at 12:17 and the second at 12:41, and Denny was outside with his phone, managing the parking situation with the focused competence of a man who has coordinated moving pieces in bad conditions for long enough that it had stopped being stressful and become simply procedural. By 1 in the afternoon there were 208 men, either inside the Grange Hall or standing in the entry, or in the yard and the Grange Hall, which had been built in 1962 to hold 100 people for a county auction, was managing this with a kind of structural resignation that Raylan respected. He was standing near the kitchen door when a man he knew from Flagstaff, a sergeant-at-arms named Burl Wicks, came to stand beside him. Burl was 61 years old and had a prosthetic left hand that he had never explained to anyone and did not intend to. He said, "You short of the number." Raylan said, "I'm aware." Burl said, "I called Williams and I called Sedona." "Williams is 40 minutes. Sedona is less." Raylan said, "How many total if they all come?" Burl said, "You'll be past 350, probably 370, 380. Raylan said, "350 is the number." Burl said, "350 it is." He went back outside to manage it. Ida Foss was still standing at the head of the table. The table was now surrounded on all sides by men sitting in chairs and standing along the walls, the folding chairs having been supplemented by chairs from the entry hall and from the kitchen, and from the beds of 3 pickup trucks, and the room was warm with bodies, and loud with the low sound of 200 men talking at a volume that is below conversation, but above silence. Ida stood in the middle of it and looked at the door and waited. A man named Trace Hollowell, who was the Ash Creek Riders' treasurer and who had been doing that job for 11 years, with the precision of someone who understood that money is a form of respect made tangible, sat 2 seats to Ida's left and had been talking to her quietly for 20 minutes about his daughter, who was also 8, who also liked horses. Ida had said that she liked horses too, and that she had read every book the West Rock Library had about horses, and that she intended to have one someday. Trace had said that was a good intention. Ida had said that intentions needed to be backed by plans. Trace had said he agreed. The conversation had continued in this vein. two people discussing the gap between wanting and having with the candor that is only possible between strangers who have no investment in each other's feelings, and Raylan, who could hear it from where he stood, thought it was the most honest exchange he had heard in months. A woman came through the door at 1:17 in the afternoon, and the temperature in the room changed. Not dramatically, not in the way that physical danger changes a room, but in the way that the arrival of an officially sanctioned complication changes any gathering, which is to say that several men near the door stood up slightly straighter, and the conversations in the vicinity went quieter without stopping. She was a county social worker named Helen Pratt, 44 years old, with a lanyard and a canvas tote, and the expression of someone who had arrived to perform a duty that they were not certain they wanted to perform. She had a clipboard. She looked at the room, and the room looked at her, and the math of what she was seeing took a visible moment to complete itself behind her eyes. She found Raylan and came toward him with the clipboard held in front of her like a document and like a shield simultaneously. She said, "I'm Helen Pratt, Coconino County Child and Family Services. I received a report that a minor was present at an unsanctioned gathering of an organized group, which requires me to assess the situation." Raylan said, "The minor is having a birthday party." Helen Pratt looked at the room. She said, "This is a birthday party." It was not a question. Raylan said, "The girl's name is Ida Foss. She is 8 years old today. Her mother is Sandra Foss, who is in the kitchen. The gathering was requested by the family." Helen Pratt looked at Ida, who was standing at the head of the table with her paper crown, and Ida looked back at her and said, "Are you here for the party?" Helen Pratt said, "I'm here to make sure everything is all right." Ida said, "We're waiting for 350. We have 208 so far." Helen Pratt looked at her clipboard and then back at Ida. She said, "Is that what you'd like for your birthday?" Ida said, "It's what I asked for." Helen Pratt stood in the middle of the room for a moment with the clipboard slightly lower than it had been, and then she looked at Sandra Foss, who had come out of the kitchen, and Sandra said, "She asked for solidarity. I told her I'd try." Helen Pratt did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "I'll need to speak with you privately, Ms. Foss, just to complete the intake. 10 minutes. Sandra nodded. Helen Pratt looked back at the room, at the 208 men filling every chair and every wall and overflowing into the entry, and something in her face that had been professionally neutral moved. Not much, but enough. She set her clipboard on the counter near the kitchen and she said, "I'll get myself some water first, if that's all right." Carla Rios said, "There's coffee on the left burner." Helen Pratt said, "That would be better." The Williams crew arrived at 1:51. 33 men who had come down from the Canyon Road and parked in the field with the discipline of everyone else, and the Sedona group came at 2:04, 29 more, and Denny was outside with a manual counter that he had found in the glove box of his truck, the kind with a button that clicks and advances the number, and he was clicking it every time a man came through the door, and he had been told that 350 was the number, and he intended to deliver 350, and not one over, and not one under. At 2:23 in the afternoon, he came through the door and walked to where Raylan was standing and said, 349. Raylan said, "Who's outside?" Denny said, "Burl Wicks. He held back when I told him we were one short, said he'd come in last." Raylan looked at Denny. Denny said, his idea. Raylan walked to the door and opened it and said, "Burl." Burl Wicks was standing outside in the cold in his cut, with his prosthetic hand in his jacket pocket, and he said, "I'm 350? Raylan said, "You're 350. Burl said, "Good. I brought something." He reached into the inside pocket of his cut and took out a small object and held it out. It was a plastic horse, the kind from a toy store bin, painted brown and white, with 3 of its 4 legs still intact, the 4th broken and glued back on with the slight misalignment of a repair done in a hurry by someone who had tried. He said, "Granddaughter left it in my truck. Heard about the girl liking horses. Thought she might want it. Raylan looked at the horse. He said, "Where'd your granddaughter get that?" Burl said, "Denny told me on the phone." Raylan looked at him for a moment, and then he stepped aside and held the door open. Burl Wicks walked through. Denny Garza clicked his counter one last time. The number was 350. He said it out loud to no one in particular. 350, and two men near him repeated it, and the repetition moved through the room in the way that important numbers move through rooms, quietly and with weight. Ida Foss heard it. She turned from the door and looked at Denny and then at Raylan and said, "Is it 350? Raylan said, "It's 350. She looked at the room. 350 men in Ash Creek Riders' cuts, and the cuts of every chapter within 2 hours of Millbrook, standing and sitting and filling the Grange Hall and the entry and the yard, all of them looking back at her, this 8-year-old girl with a paper crown and both hands on a tablecloth, looking at them the way she had been looking at the door all morning. Then Ida Foss looked at the chair in front of her, the chair that had been pulled out and placed there since 8:15 in the morning, the chair with the juice cup in front of it. She looked at it for a moment, and then she sat down. 350 men stood up, not because anyone said to. Not because Raylan gave any signal or Denny made any call. They stood up the way a single thing becomes a single thing, which is all at once and without consultation, every man in the room coming to his feet in the moment that Ida Foss took her seat, and the sound it made was not a roar, and not applause, and not anything that has a name. It was the sound of 350 people deciding simultaneously to be present for one specific person, which is a sound that once you have heard it you do not forget, and do not mistake for anything else. Burl Wicks stood near the door with the plastic horse in his prosthetic hand, and his jaw working in the way jaws work when a man has decided not to do something with his face that he is going to do with his face anyway. Helen Pratt stood near the kitchen with her coffee cup and her clipboard forgotten on the counter, and she was standing too. She had stood with everyone else without knowing she was going to, and later she would not be able to say exactly when it happened, only that it happened. Carla Rios stood in the kitchen doorway and did not bother with her face at all. Sandra Foss was sitting on the floor against the east wall because her legs had stopped participating, and she had found the floor before the floor found her, and she was crying fully now, not the held-back crying of the morning, but the other kind, the kind that means the thing you asked for against all reasonable expectation has been given, the kind that has no performance in it. And Raylan saw her and walked over and sat down on the floor beside her, not to say anything, because there was nothing to say that the room had not already said, but because sitting on the floor beside a person is sometimes the only architecture equal to the moment. Ida's voice came from the head of the table, clear and practical and 8 years old. She said, "Now can we have the cake?" The laughter that followed was real, and it was warm, and it went all the way to the rafters of the 1962 Grange Hall and rattled the sagging balloons. And for a moment, the room was simply full of people who had been somewhere important together, which is one of the few things that does not require any further explanation. Burl Wicks brought the plastic horse to Ida and set it on the table in front of her. She picked it up and looked at the repaired leg, the slight angle of the glue repair, and she said, "What happened to it?" Burl said, "Got broken. Got fixed." She turned it in her hands. She said, "What's its name?" Burl said, "Didn't come with one." She considered this with the seriousness it deserved. She said, "I'll name it later, when I know it better." Burl said, "That's the right way to do it." He went back to his spot near the door. 3 months later, in February, the Ash Creek Riders held a chapter meeting at the clubhouse on CR 6144, and Trace Hollowell put a motion on the table. The motion was to establish a fund, the Foss Fund as it came to be called informally and then formally, to cover the cost of Sandra Foss's back rent and Ida's enrollment in the after-school program at West Rock Elementary that had a waiting list and a fee structure that had been putting it beyond reach. The motion passed without discussion, which meant it passed 12-0 because there were 12 voting members in the room, and nobody spoke against it, and nobody abstained. Trace cut the first check 2 days later and drove it out to Sandra Foss himself and set it on her kitchen table and said, "This isn't charity." "It's what the club voted," Sandra said. "I don't know how to thank you." Trace said, "You don't need to. Your daughter did the work." In April, Ida started the after-school program. In May, she was doing well enough that her teacher wrote a note home that Sandra put on the refrigerator under a magnet shaped like the state of Arizona, and the note said that Ida had written an essay about her birthday party that the teacher had put in the monthly newsletter. The essay was 4 paragraphs long. The last paragraph said that she had learned that solidarity was not a word from a book. It was a sound. It was the sound of 350 people standing up. Raylan Cord read the newsletter because Sandra mailed him a copy, and it arrived on a Thursday morning when he was sitting at the table in the clubhouse with his coffee going cold and the winter light coming flat through the east window. He read it twice. He folded it and put it in the inside pocket of his cut, against his chest, where it stayed for the remainder of that winter, growing soft at the fold lines the way things do when they are carried and carried and carried against a body that is trying to keep them close. He thought, as he sometimes did in the specific way he allowed himself to think it, about 2011, about the hospital corridor, about the thing that had not been savable. He had stood there alone with his hands hanging and no number anywhere, no 350, no 40, no one, just the particular silence of a door that would not open and a name that would not answer. He had carried that for 13 years. Not the grief which had done what grief does, which is transform without disappearing, but the specific weight of having been one person when more people were needed. He had carried it the way you carry a stone in a shoe, not constantly aware of it, but never entirely free of it either. Ida Foss had stood at a table for 2 hours with a paper crown and her hands flat on a cloth, and she had waited for 350, not because she was desperate, but because she understood something about numbers that most adults had argued themselves out of understanding, which is that some things require a certain count before they become what they are supposed to be, and below that count they are only almost. He had not been 350 for the person who needed it in 2011. He was. He had been whatever he was, which was 1, and 1 had not been the number. He had spent 13 years knowing that. He did not expect Ida Foss to have fixed it. He did not think it was fixed, but the stone in the shoe was lighter than it had been, which was not nothing, which was, in fact, the beginning of something he did not yet have a name for, the way Ida had said she would name the horse later, when she knew it better. He thought that was the right way to do it. In June, the Ash Creek Riders voted to add a small embroidered patch to the inside collar of every cut made for the chapter going forward. The patch was not visible from outside. It was a number, 350. It was Denny's idea, proposed at the June meeting, seconded by Burl Wicks, carried 14-0. Trace Hollowell ordered the patches from a woman in Flagstaff who did embroidery for clubs, and she asked him what the number meant, and he said it meant a little girl sat down. She made the patches with gold thread on a black ground and delivered them in a flat box the following week, and Trace distributed them at the July meeting, and every man present sewed his own in that night in the clubhouse, which was the kind of ceremony that is not called a ceremony but is one, the kind where men who do not speak easily about tenderness find a way to carry it with them, hidden, against the inside of something they never take off. Raylan sewed his in last. He turned the cut inside out on the table and he held the patch, and he felt the specific weight of a thing that is both small and permanent, and he pressed it to the collar lining, and he worked the needle through with the hands that had been marked by 30 years of doing things, the hands with the crooked fourth finger, the hands that had been hanging useless in a hospital corridor once and had not known what to do, and he sewed the number in. 350. That was what it took. That was what the little girl had known and waited for and held her ground for. 2 hours with a paper crown and her hands on a tablecloth, while the world outside sorted itself into the right count. Some things cannot be done by one. Some things cannot be done by almost. Some things wait at the head of the table, patient and correct, until the number comes through the door, and then they sit down, and the sound of 350 people standing up at once is not a roar and not applause. It is the oldest sound there is, the sound of enough, which is the only sound, in the end, that was ever worth riding toward.